Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a tabletop game designer, a lover of history, and a lifelong player of Age of Empires 2. And on this series, Theorycrafting, I take a look at civilizations and units not yet present in AoE2 and give my best stab at creating a believable and historically grounded framework for how they might look if they were implemented in the game. On this episode, we are continuing with the Celtic Triad, a series of 3 builds, beginning with the Scots last week and continuing on with everyone's favorite scrappy English neighbor, the Welsh. Much like the Scots last week, the Welsh have a very special place in my own heart, as they too are a major part of my own heritage. They're a fascinating people with a beautiful language and a very fraught history, so without further ado, let's dive into them. Though, before we do that, as always, take a look on screen right now if you want any disclaimers on my approach to theory crafting, and if you want to see my general philosophy when I'm approaching these builds, and with game design as a whole. Additionally, as always, a link to a comprehensive civilization document including all of my sources can be found down in the description. With all that being said, let's move on to an overview of Welsh history. Unlike the Scots, who managed to secure a pretty strong niche in the European political scene by the end of the AoE2 relevant time frame, Wales did not have that same lasting geopolitical impact. But the Welsh are a much older people than the Scots, at least in terms of how long they have inhabited their namesake homeland. There is substantial evidence of Welsh people existing in Wales as long ago as pre-Roman times, and they would retain their homeland very, very comfortably, interacting heavily with their Celtic neighbors, along with their eastern neighbors, be they the Romans or later on the Saxons and Angles, or one of many other Brythonic Celtic peoples that inhabited the area over the centuries. Now, once 577 rolled around, this is generally the time that we see Wales sectioned off as being its own distinct subset of England. They did, however, conduct a great many raids, enough so that the Mercian king Offa constructed a massive man-made ditch cutting off pretty much all of Wales, known now as Offa's Dyke, which is, across all of Western European history, the single longest man-made fortification ever crafted, and still exists to this very day. Now, Wales was far from a united land during this period. In fact, it was subdivided into 4 major states with many minor states nested within them, those being the northern state of Gwynedd, the eastern state of Powys, the southern state of Deheubarth, and the southwestern state of Dyfed, though later on Dyfed would be subsumed into Deheubarth as well, leading to 3 states. So that wouldn't be for another couple hundred years. And these 3 states fought pretty substantially until around 878, when the first of Wales's medieval high kings came to power, unifying the entire country and making it, for the first time in quite a while, a serious geopolitical threat, at least within their little corner of England. Now, there had been Welsh high kings before, but from all we can tell about them, which is admittedly not very much, they didn't seem to have had that much influence or impact. The high kings that started in 878, however, had quite a lot. A few of them were powerful enough to even challenge their Anglo-Saxon neighbors, but unfortunately, this great unification would come just in time for the Vikings to show up. It was mostly Danes who were invading Wales during this era. And unfortunately for the newly unified Wales, between Viking raids and German incursions, their newly unified country started to face an awful lot of troubles and was gradually weakened over the next 2 centuries. Now, this would eventually be interrupted by the influx of the Normans. You know the story. They came trotting in 1066, Hastings, Harold Godwinson, etc., etc., etc. Now we have some Frenchmen in charge of England, and though they initially ignored Wales, within a couple decades of them setting up shop, they began to push westward into Welsh lands. The Welsh fought viciously against these advances, repelling armies that were many times their size, skill level, and equipment level on numerous occasions, so much so that the Normans by about 1094, despite heavily fortifying a good chunk of Wales, were actually forced to retreat past Offa's Dyke. This left a kind of weird no man's land between Norman territory and Welsh territory that would be called the Marches, then to be ruled by the Marcher Lords, who would later go on to be very influential in both Welsh and English politics, with a lot more autonomy than any other English nobles would ever be so lucky to have, but also faced by the constant threat of Welsh raiding. And Welsh raiding there was. Plenty of it, in fact, with the Marcher Lords serving as kind of a buffer zone between England and Wales, preventing the Normans, later to evolve into the English proper, from really suffering too much at their hands. But by the 1200s, this raiding back and forthness would start to subside as Wales would once again rise, no longer unified by high kings. They were instead ruled by a great prince, a Prince of Wales, as the English would title it, and by the 1260s, they were even recognized as an independent nation, holding a lot of influence within the English court, as well as having admirers as far away as France. Then we find Edward the First. Oh, naughty, naughty Longshanks. He ruined everything for poor little Wales, didn't he? And really did an awful lot of work to completely stomp what few gains Wales had made back into the ground before they could really capitalize further upon them. This meant that by the 1300s, the Welsh were well and truly subjects of the English crown once again, and would be very readily integrated into the English army, serving as incredibly well-paid and well-regarded mercenaries, despite their notoriety for being unruly, unmanageable, and better equipped with daring than with arms, according to one writer of the time. Now, they would join Edward and later English kings on campaigns into Scotland, into France, but by the 1400s, Wales was starting to brew another rebellion, and this one would be an absolute doozy. Though they were loyal subjects to the English crown at many times, they still often suffered injustices under the English legal system and were occasionally taxed into oblivion. And so in about 1405, this spark ignited a great rebellion led by the charismatic noble Owain Glyndwr, until his family was eventually captured a couple years later. He was forced underground, and the rebellion petered out by around 1416, with his son officially capitulating to the English in 1421. The penalties that the English imposed on Wales during the rebellion lingered well after it, forcing a large percentage of the Welsh populace into substantial poverty and oppression, as well as building still more resentment. But finally, by 1485, well over 2 generations later, an English king rose to the throne who was himself of Welsh origin, that being Henry VII, I believe. And he repealed virtually all of these harshly penalizing laws, and spearheaded a massive integration movement to try to make Wales part of Britain proper, rather than kind of a client state that occasionally caused trouble. By the 1500s, especially the late 1500s, the Welsh were firm subjects of the British crown, and in fact were some of its loyalist supporters, firmly taking the side of the crown during the Great English Civil War and remaining loyal to it even during Cromwell's reign. But that takes us well beyond the AoE2 relevant time frame. So where are the Welsh now? Well, for quite some time, the Welsh have been, for most intents and purposes, English themselves today. But they still retain an awful lot of cultural autonomy, even today holding a substantial amount of political autonomy as a subset of the English Parliament within Wales itself. It is rare that you see an integration success story like this, but the Welsh managed to pull it off, though the road to get there was of course extremely bumpy, littered as it was with the corpses of many valiant freedom fighters. With that all said, let's move on to the flavor, the lovely aesthetic details that make an Age of Empires Civ what it is. The Welsh would have Western European architecture with unique skins for the archery range and castle. Unsurprisingly, the range is very important for the Welsh. Their language would be Middle Welsh, Croeso, ladies and gentlemen. This is a more modern Welsh greeting. I could not for the life of me find anything in Middle Welsh, but it's a lovely language and should be a lot easier to research than other more obscure ones that certain civilizations already in-game use. Their wonder would be Raglan Castle. This was, I believe, constructed by the English during the 13th or 14th century, but would later be inhabited largely by Welshmen and is of course a gorgeous building. Wales is littered with castles, though as we'll discuss later, almost all of them were constructed by one of its many invaders and occupiers over the years. I just decided to go with the one that I thought looked nicest and most wonder-like. If you want to see any AI player names, take a look on screen right now. We got a good amount of offerings for you today. Always remember that you can take a look at all these details in full on the Civilization document linked down in the description below. And now, let us move on to some campaigns. I was pleasantly surprised by how many good campaigns there would be for the Welsh. So let's begin with the three that I like best, beginning with Rhodri Mor. Now, this fellow was the first High King of medieval Wales. He rose to power after winning some stunning outnumbered victories against Viking Danes before later pushing back the Saxons, gaining allies among the Irish, and even courting the mighty Frankish Empire under Charlemagne before finally being killed in battle. This man laid the groundwork for all future Welsh successes, though of course those successes would often have trouble being fully capitalized upon. A classic unifying underdog story, which as we'll see in a moment, is pretty common to see in Welsh history. But another option we have instead of Rhodri Mor is Llywelyn the Great. Now, he came substantially after Rhodri, about 400 years later, ruling in the 1200s during Wales's greatest period during the High Middle Ages. And Llywelyn was a big part of their success in this regard. After embarking on a unifying conquest of the nation, he started to play a very tactical political game against the English, refusing to pay homage to the English king and making demands of the marcher lords at his borders, and the English really weren't able to stand up to him, setting a precedent for Welsh independence that could have gone so many places were it not for the fact that his successor was really underprepared to deal with the burdens left to him by his forebear, leading his unified Wales to break down shortly after his death thanks to opportunistic attacks launched by the English. Regardless, Llywelyn brought Wales as close as it ever got to being an equal to the English, and for that reason alone, he deserves a spot on this list of possible campaign protagonists. Lastly, though, we have the obvious pick. If you know anything about Welsh history, it's probably this man, Owain Glyndwr. One of the most famous freedom fighters of all time, I would say his exploits blow even William Wallace's out of the water. He was a charismatic aristocrat, studied in London, worked with the English for a large part of his life, but finally after returning to Wales, he was snubbed by English courts and lost a good amount of his fortune to unjust legal decisions, and started to discuss his discontent with fellow Welshmen, realizing as he did so that there was a lot of rebellious spirit still left alive in the Welsh people. Thus began his great 15-plus-year-long rebellion where he declared himself the newest High King of Wales, gained the support of well over half the country, and embarked on a long-form guerrilla war against the English, winning many, many victories before his family was captured. He was forced underground, and as I mentioned in the history section, everything just kind of petered out. It's still not really known today what happened to him, but what is known is that his son and successor eventually was forced to capitulate to the English, though in the process receiving an official pardon for his father, who the English, despite of how much of a pain he had been, really, really admired. He is the obvious pick for a Welsh campaign protagonist. Honestly, if you didn't choose him, it would be kind of a travesty. So though I do like the other options as well, Owain Glyndwr gets my pick for a Welsh campaign protagonist, should the civilization be brought into Age of Empires 2. Now, a couple of potential appearances for the Welsh in existing campaigns right now. We have Edward Longshanks. We have a whole 2 scenarios devoted solely to fighting the Welsh. And we also kind of have York. In York currently, the Scots and Welsh are kind of bundled into one faction, but if you could split them up, then having the civilization there would fit perfectly. But beyond that, don't really have any other good options. Before we leave off though, I want to touch upon a couple of other decent campaign protagonist ideas. I was kind of shocked with just how many good ones Wales had to offer in its history. And so even though all 3 that I have I think are well above these 3, I would be remiss not to mention them as some interesting alternate options. Starting with Hywel Dda. Hywel the Good. Hywel! That's me! My name is Hywel. There's a decent chance that my last name Hywel is in fact of Welsh origin. Now, Hywel the Good was a very successful Welsh king who ruled a little bit after Rhodri Mor, like in the mid-900s AD. And he is most notable for imposing a great sweeping social and legal reform that effectively modernized Wales to the standards of other European states at the time. His work did a lot to legitimize Wales in the eyes of other powers. He even did a pilgrimage to Rome Rome to meet the Pope, and he was on equal footing to his Mercian and Wessexian neighbors. In summary, a very respectable campaign protagonist, most notable for sharing my name. Another option, Gruffydd ap Llywelyn. Now, Gruffydd ruled in the 1000s AD, just before the Norman invasion, and he began as a prince of Powys, the eastern Welsh state, but would quickly spread his influence, eventually laying claim to almost all of Wales, not quite enough to be a true high king, and was incredibly aggressive towards all of his Germanic and Danish neighbors. He even started to play them against each other in this elaborate game of political chess, while also violently crushing his Welsh rivals internally. But all of this ambition caught up to him, and he was eventually ambushed and killed in battle by the Mercians in about 1063 AD. A very intense ruler who could make for a very drama-filled campaign, but he doesn't really have the name recognition of some of the others I've mentioned thus far. A last option for you is Owen Gwynedd, a daring ruler from the northern state of Gwynedd from the mid to late 1100s AD. He was never a high king, but he played a very tactful political game with his fellow Welshmen, claiming land from them and fending off English threats, and most interestingly, unified with the ruler of Deheubarth, the southernmost Welsh state, ruled at the time by Rhys ap Gruffydd, to throw off English incursions into their shared realm, which I think could make for a really interesting co-op campaign. So if the Welsh were ever singled out to have specifically a co-op campaign made for them, I think that Owen Gwynedd and Rhys ap Gruffydd could make for a really interesting dynamic duo. With that all being said, let's move on to some major themes, overarching patterns and threads that I started to notice emerging consistently as I was reading through Welsh history, beginning with guerrilla warfare. The Welsh were terrifying to the disciplined and heavily armed and well-trained troops that were often invading them. They were able to pull off these really effective classic hit-and-run tactics within dense woodlands and were enormously mobile despite not fielding very much cavalry. This is made even more impressive by the fact that they were pretty much always on the back foot. Their enemies were typically far more numerous and much better armed, and yet the Welsh still consistently drove them away in a number of the most stunning defeats, to the point where the Normans couldn't wait to get out of Wales despite the resources they had invested trying to fortify and secure the region. Couple this with the fact that the Welsh were quite brutal, rarely took prisoners, and often mutilated the ones that they took, and you have a contender for one of the most tenacious medieval civilizations the world ever knew. Another overarching theme, the verge of independence. Wales got so close to being its own stable nation state on so many occasions, and whenever it would have a major triumph, being united and brought to greatness by a successful ruler like Llywelyn the Great, it was always screwed up by some dumb succession struggle or some awful fluke of luck. Part of this was because the succession laws within Wales were archaic and crappy for a pretty substantial portion of the Middle Ages, but even after they were reformed, it always felt like whoever followed up one of their great acts just couldn't deliver and was brought down by their more powerful neighbors. But this isn't to say that Wales was helpless. As mentioned above, they were masters of guerrilla warfare, and since they were pretty much constantly either being invaded or under threat of being invaded, their populace was almost perpetually militarized, not to mention incredibly resentful of their more dominant overlords, and these traits make it very easy for rebellions to pop up out of nowhere and get out of hand very, very quick. Not to mention, the Welsh court, even when it was fully unified, was itinerant. They didn't have a permanent capital, and so the king and his entourage would constantly be on the move. This was even the case within the divided kingdoms of Wales. All their leaders would constantly be on the move, making it not only quite hard to centralize the nation, which obviously would be a problem when they were trying to retain independence as a strong European state, but would by contrast make many pockets of Welsh people far more loyal to their rulers because they would be able to interact with them on a more regular basis than if they were tucked away in some high and mighty capital city. Now, last major theme was archery and mercenary work, both of which the Welsh were absolutely famed for. Now, they sold their skills to England pretty much from the 1200s and on, and probably did so earlier as well. Despite not being super well armed and not super well trained, they were still considered, as mentioned before, among England's finest soldiers and were paid extremely well, meaning that they often became very loyal to the crown when they weren't rebelling. Additionally, the Welsh were the unparalleled masters of the longbow within the British Isles. Yes, the English would go on to make it famous and perfect it, but they inherited many of their traditions from the Welsh. It was even observed by Normans that the Welsh longbows were very rough, carved from a piece of elm rather than the yew that we know now, and were often unpolished and full of splinters, and yet these rough pieces of elm were able to propel arrows so effectively that they could pierce 2 layers of Norman armor and pin a man to his horse, as happened in one famous scenario where 3 Norman knights were ambushed, 2 were killed, and the 3rd was stapled by arrows through both his legs to his mount and then sent packing back to camp to warn them of why they shouldn't be in Wales in the first place. Lastly, though they were most famed for their archery, the Welsh were also really well known as spearmen. And once the English started to retire the foot longbowmen and started to promote mounted longbowmen as their elite corps, the Welsh mercenaries among them were mostly relegated to flanking troops armed with spears, very lightly armored, but incredibly good at rushing to intercept enemy cavalry flanking attempts to protect the army's sides from being outmaneuvered. And with that all being said, we come to the end of this Welsh history section. If that's all you were here for, thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe before you go. But if you, like me, love Age of Empires and want to see what I've done with this Welsh civilization, let us move on to the game mechanics, beginning with some necessary updates. Much like the Scots last week, go check them out if you haven't seen them yet, the Welsh will benefit from quite a number of regional units that span, in some cases, all Celtic peoples, and in other cases, all the British Isles, and in other cases, just they and their neighbors, beginning with the Galoglas. While most famous as a Gaelic troop in the service of the Irish and the Scots, there is evidence that the Welsh hired Gaelic mercenaries on a number of occasions, despite they themselves not being Goidelic Celts. This Galoglas unit is trained from the castle, very heavy infantry, shared across the team, but they keep the source player's bonuses and unique technologies. The Galoglas can swap between 2 melee weapons, an anti-elite armor-piercing Sparth axe, and a massive claymore, the famous 2-handed sword that gives them a substantial amount of splash damage. This weapon switch would work exactly like a Wrath. They cost 30 food and 65 gold, so quite a substantial investment, but they really are exceptionally tanky and high damage, particularly for an infantryman. It should be noted, however, that the Welsh lack the elite Galoglas, meaning that if their team has no other civilization providing this unit, no one on their team will be able to get higher than the Castle Age iteration. Moving on, the Welsh also have access to the mighty Longbowmen, promoted from a unique unit to a regional unit available to both they and later English civilizations that we will tackle down the line. This Longbowman is an alternative upgrade path to the existing Archer line, available for upgrade in the Castle Age instead of Crossbowmen. The longbow has more range than the crossbowmen and a small amount of bonus attack versus cavalry, as well as having its cost adjusted, costing plus 15 wood, but minus 10 gold, exactly like it is in-game right now. Its upgrade cost is also wood instead of food, but these cost adjustments are definitely secondary to the main draw of the longbowmen, namely their substantial bonus range. Any civilization that has access to them, such as the Welsh, will have a massive range advantage over their opponent, though not quite as dominant as the Britons do now. And additionally, the Welsh even have another benefit for this unit class, namely, they have a unique pre-upgrade replacing the Archer, namely the Elm Bowman. The Elm Bowman is available to the Welsh alone in Feudal Age and upgrades into the Longbowman, and the Elm Bowman shares many of the properties of the Longbowman in comparison to the existing Archer. It has that tiny bonus attack versus cavalry, which could make the difference in early feudal fights. It has +1 range, which is huge in Feudal Age, and it has an adjusted cost. The only real downside that the Elm Bowman has is that it has a slightly longer training time, making it ever so slightly harder to mass up, but will still be an absolutely devastating presence in Feudal Age. Now, last thing that the Welsh have access to is the Hobelar. This replaces the Hussar, much like the Winged Hussar, and is cheaper overall to research. It is a lot squishier and has lower damage than the Hussar, but it has more speed, costs -5 food, and gains bonus attack when behind its target, as well as ignoring the collision of any non-Hobelar unit, allowing it to run through your and your opponent's units alike to reach the nice squishy stuff in their back lines. If you want any more details on the Hobelar or the Galoglas in terms of their history, again, check out my Scots build. I should also note that both the Hobelar and the Longbowmen would be gained by the existing Britons, though I do have plans to subdivide that civilization sometime in the future. Let's move on to an overview of the Welsh as a civilization. The Welsh, an archer civilization. Bonus number 1, advancing in age does not occupy town center production queue, but is 66% slower. What the hell does that mean? Well, you know when you click age up, you have that advance bar up in the top of your screen? Instead of your town center holding the technology, it lives in that bar. Your town center can do whatever it wants while an age up is advancing. And if that town center is destroyed, the age up is not canceled. It is a lot slower, but this bonus will mean that the Welsh will be substantially ahead of their opponent on villagers, particularly in the dark to feudal age transition. That's a monstrous economy bonus, but the Welsh have many other substantial limitations on their economy besides this. It's an interesting bonus, isn't it? And it's trying to reference the fact that not only did the Welsh have a very decentralized state with an itinerant court, so that you never really have a capital building researching your age-up technology, but also to show how the Welsh advanced as a society a good deal slower than their neighbors. They were always playing catch-up to other civilizations. Second bonus, archer attacks have minus 40% delay and do not reveal source units. That's a complicated one. What does that mean? Well, any unit you make out of your archery range is going to have a much faster windup before they shoot their projectile, making the Welsh one of the most effective archer micro-civilizations in the game. Additionally, if a Welsh archer is shooting from the fog of war to a unit that cannot see them, they won't be revealed. In-game currently, anytime a unit does this, they'll show up within the fog of war, not the Welsh. You can sneakily snipe enemies off without them being able to know where the arrows are coming from if they're not paying attention. And this again gives you all sorts of sneaky options to do raids, skirmishing, and to even prevent enemies from auto-aggroing onto you if their player isn't paying attention while you're shooting from the fog of war. A very versatile bonus with some really interesting raiding potential. Third bonus, projectiles fired at your units have minus 5/10/15% accuracy starting in the feudal age. I guess that should probably say 0/5/10/15. Sorry guys. Anyways, this accuracy penalty applies to all projectiles, even ones that normally have perfect accuracy, like ships, castles, anything. Your units are just a lot dodgier than normal, and this does apply to things like your gala glasses that would be shared by your team. Now, this is again mostly going to be a benefit in raiding, but in late game scenarios where projectiles are flying everywhere like in a trash war, you're going to get some incremental value with this because it's going to mean that your units don't eat as many arrows as they normally would. As you might expect, both this and the former bonus are both in reference to the mastery the Welsh had over guerrilla warfare. Hit and run tactics, hiding in the trees, they were very, very slippery. And these two bonuses should fulfill that element of their history quite effectively. Fourth bonus. Archer armor upgrades each provide plus 5% speed. Once again, guerrilla warfare. The Welsh were incredibly fast, and their soldiers, even when serving in the English military, were noted for how fleet of foot they were, as well as on average wearing much less armor than many of their English fellows. This bonus is just the cherry on top for the Welsh archery range, and even further focuses the civilization onto that building. Team bonus. Each castle built can train up to 3 free longbowmen. This works exactly like the Cuman mercenaries technology, but it's for free, but you only get 3 things out of it. Longbowmen built by your teammates will use your current upgrade level, so if you haven't upgraded past Elm Bowman, your teammates can build Elm Bowman, etc., but will use the source player's archer upgrades like Thumb Ring, Archer Armor Techs, etc. So plenty of players aren't going to get a ton of use out of this, but hey, they're free units and will probably be able to serve some sort of benefit even if you only have a few castles up in total. But for the Welsh player, this will just add to their ever-growing stockpile of longbows and will be a great way to assist in massing those critical units up in mid and late game scenarios. This bonus references Welsh work as mercenaries, as well as how heavily fortified Wales was by its many invaders. The Normans and English-built castles all over the countryside, which the Welsh would often use for their own purposes later on, and so consolidating these two bonuses into one, with allies getting Welsh mercenaries as they fortify the land. Let's move on to their uniques. We've already covered the Elm Bowman earlier, so let's move on to their castle unique unit, the Uchelwr. This is a cavalry unit costing a whopping 60 food, 60 wood, and 60 gold. Jeez, it's a very tanky, light cavalry. It is more HP and speed than a knight, but has less armor and damage, substantially less damage, as well as a much slower training time. Probably the slowest training castle unique unit in the game. However, the first time an Uchelwr attacks, it spawns a free, no population costing spearman, skirmisher, and longbowmen of whatever your current upgrades are around itself, all tasked to attack the same target the Uchelwer is currently attacking. Now, as I said, these units are completely free and take 0 population space. However, if any of these free units leave the Uchelwer's line of sight, they vanish instantaneously, but the next time the Uchelwer attacks, they are respawned. If at any point one of these free units is killed, they're gone forever, regardless of whether they leave line of sight or not. Now, who were the Uchelwer? These were noble Welsh cavalrymen, who often made up the small elite core at the heart of a Welsh army, surrounded by throngs of irregulars, and every Uchelwer would take with them a small hand-picked group of retainers to assist them in battle as their bodyguards and helpers. This unit comes from that tendency, as well as, again, the Welsh penchant for guerrilla tactics. You swarm in with just a couple of Uchelwer, and suddenly you have a massive army right in your opponent's grill that can be quickly brought to safety just by running your Uchelwer away from the action. I should note, though, that if the Uchelwer itself is killed, all of its spawned units die instantly as well. A really unusual cavalry unit that very much cements the Welsh as having a hit-and-run raiding type of playstyle, and is very high risk, high reward. I could see it becoming a fan favorite or something that people love to hate. Let's take a look at their unique technologies real quick. First, Teulu. The Teulu was the noble household, who, along with the Uchelwer, would make up the core of the Welsh heavy cavalry. Teulu gives all of your melee cavalry units, including the Uchelwer, a javelin attack. This has the same damage as normal and has a fairly limited range, doesn't benefit from any archer attack upgrades, but it can only be used once every 8 seconds, recharging with a little progress bar like a charge attack would. Additionally, it can only charge when you are outside of combat, meaning that you can use things like knights and light cav, not to mention your Uchelwer, for hit-and-run raiding as though they were cavalry archers, completely changing how the unit works, which, as you'll see, is something pretty necessary for them to be viable. Because without this upgrade, the Welsh have absolutely atrocious cavalry. Last unique technology in the Imperial Age is Merdrefi. This allows town centers to be built instantaneously and gives villagers plus 20% speed. Merdrefi were village centers that were scattered all across Wales, which lords would stop at during their itinerant tours of their realms. A Merdref was a rather flexible designation, and they would kind of pop up and disappear all the time based on economic and local circumstances, and definitely contributed to the overall decentralization of Welsh society in general. It's kind of a random set of bonuses, I know, but I think the two kind of connect well through that piece of history, and as you'll see, the villager speed boost is making up for a pretty substantial weakness that the Welsh start to have once they hit the end of Castle Age. As always, if you want any further details on any of these bonuses or uniques, take a look at the full civilization document linked down in the description below. Let's move on to the Welsh tech tree. Letter grades, beginning with their infantry, it's a C-. They have the Gala Glass, but it's unupgraded, and that's where the good stuff ends. No champion, no chainmail armor, no arson, no gambesons. I should note, the Welsh lack chainmail armor, but they do have plate mail armor. Kind of weird, but there's no reason the game can't do something like this. But all it means is that the Welsh will have a substantial drop-off in infantry power earlier than usual for civilizations that would normally miss one infantry armor upgrade. And so overall, really the only reason you will ever use infantry as the Welsh is if you are using their halberdiers or you are trying to make use of some cheeky galloglasses in Castle Age. Their archers, on the other hand, are an A+. I debated an S grade even. They have, I would guess, some of the best archers in the game. They don't have hand cannon, heavy cavalry archer, Parthian tactics. Whoop-de-frickin-do. They have the unique Elm bowman all the way into the elite longbowmen. They have their attack delay and no reveal bonuses. They have the speed boost off of the armor upgrades. They have full armor upgrades, by the way, and they get free longbows from castles. That makes for a devastating archer civilization, easily worth an A+. Cavalry is a C+. It's very much a mixed bag. They have the regional Hobilar, they have the Uchelwer, and they have the Teulu technology. But they do like Paladin, Bloodlines, oof, and Scale Barding armor. That's bad. That means that they're going to be on the back foot for armor upgrades throughout the entire course of the game, even if they hit their timings. Because of this, Welsh cavalry in early game is F tier. It's like the worst in the game by far. But once they hit post-Imperial Age, their cavalry will be good, maybe even quite good, because of strong options like the Hobilar and Uchelwer made even more strong and versatile thanks to the Teulu technology. Overall, I feel like a C+ is most reasonable. I could see it being as low as a C. Siege. It's a D. Some of the worst siege in the game. No siege engineers, and no siege upgrades at all besides capture ammo. Bleh, it's really, really bad. Use trebs, don't use anything else. Defenses, it's a C-. It's not great either. They don't get fortified wall, bombard tower, architecture, or hoardings, though they do get free longbows out of their castle, so that's something. Economy, it's a B+. Medrefi is a nice little boost in Imperial Age, and while they have that absolutely devastating age advance bonus from the get-go, they lack handcart. That's really bad for late game economy. And they don't have crop rotation or guilds. Because of this, I would put the Welsh early game economy at an A+. They'll be up by like 4 or 5 villagers in feudal age, and they'll only extend this lead into castle age, but they'll start to fall off pretty hard in imperial age, and even the benefits granted by Medrefi will not fully compensate for how important handcart is, especially for late game farming setups. Overall, I think a B+ is a fair compromise. Amazing early, crappy late, kind of the inverse of their cavalry grade. Levies, namely units that do not cost gold. It's a term I use instead of trash, with the opposite being elites, namely units that do cost gold. It's a B-. They have the Hobilar, and they have very good skirmishers, but their melee levies, like the Halberdier and Hobilar, really are pretty squishy due to both missing an armor upgrade. So while their skirms are certainly well above average, and the Hobilar is nice, I don't think that their trash is going to be that good. I could see B- maybe being a little low, maybe a B is better, because they do have that accuracy reduction thing, which I think will be most useful in Trash Wars. Dock, it's a C. They don't have careening, which sucks, and they don't have fire ship, which really sucks. They do get fire raft though, so that'll do something in feudal age water fights. They also lack elite cannon galleon for what it's worth, and I do think that the accuracy reduction will be fairly impactful on water fights, not to mention that they actually have shipwright. So I would say overall the Welsh have a respectable early dock, maybe even a good one thanks to their economy bonus, but later on, really a mixed bag. And lastly, their monks. It's a B. They don't have block printing. Block printing is nice to have in late game, but otherwise their monks are monks. Monks are sad and make me sad. Let's move on. Playstyle. Now that we have a good idea of what the Welsh tech tree looks like, I have a few thoughts on how it might end up actually looking in practice. Beginning with their early game, I think they will have one of the best feudal ages in the entire game. They'll have that huge vill advantage, though they will have slightly worse timing, but they also have, I'm going to say it, the best archer rush in the entire game. The Elm Bowman by itself is already amazing, but on top of that, they have bonus speed from the first archer armor upgrade, they have reduced accuracy on all enemy projectiles, and on top of all that, they have the reduced firing delay and no reveal effects off of their second civilization bonus. That's unbelievably good. They're going to have such devastating hit and run potential with their archers, really only held back by the fact that it's going to take them a little bit longer to get to that rush than other generic civilizations. Also, on top of that, the Elm Bowman gets a small attack bonus versus cavalry, so good luck countering them with scouts. And their dominance will probably continue a bit into mid-game. Their archers are still really, really good, and you'll be able to get these nice little raiding parties set up that are super satisfying to micro and are hard to counter, taking down knights way easier than they normally would be able to. You can even mix in a little bit of cavalry if you manage to pick up Teolu or can train a couple of Uchelwers. However, their economy does start to fall off by the end of Castle Age. Not having handcart really does suck, and by late game, these economy problems will only get worse. Your archers are still really good though. You're going to have a 60 stack of these on Control Group 1 and it's going to feel great. But besides that, all of their power units have serious flaws. Their trash is overall pretty good, and you can do some cool stuff with like Teolu Uchelwer or Cavalier or something like that, but your siege is really, really bad. You'll still want to be raiding constantly because it's what your civilization thrives at, and you really aren't going to be able to attack your enemy head-on thanks to just how terrible your siege weapons are. Your eco also really doesn't get much better. Yes, you have Medrefi that can kind of compensate for missing handcart, but since you miss the big HC on top of a couple of other essential late-game eco technologies, you're not going to be in a great position in that regard and will really have to wear down your opponent with the sheer strength of your archers alone. And lastly, before we wrap this build up, let's take a look at a couple of loose threads, some questions that weren't quite answered for me as I was finishing up the design, beginning with some of my major uncertainties. That economy bonus is really, really good. Like, really good. It might just be too good. I thought that handcart would be a pretty big downside, but as I'm looking at it again, might not be enough. Like, maybe we could remove wheelbarrow instead of handcart. Or maybe we could remove both wheelbarrow and handcart. Can you believe that? I don't want to warp the civilization too much, but it might be necessary to go that far. Along those lines, they do have a really lopsided tech tree. Their archers are so good, and their other units are just not. Like, especially the fact that their siege and infantry are so subpar, and their cavalry and dock are only like really, really mediocre when their archers are so good. I don't know, man. It might just be too extreme. And lastly, despite how lopsided their tech tree is and how much it will drag down the civilization, their archers might still win the day single-handedly. Archers are, on average, the best or at least second best unit type in the game, and having archers this good might just be too dominant. I'm really not sure. What do you guys think? Do you think their archers are too good? Tell me in the comments below. Let's talk about a couple of tabled ideas. These are thoughts I had that felt cool, but didn't quite make the build. We'll try to get through these fast. I always say that. 1. What if enemy melee attacks also missed in addition to projectile attacks? Felt kind of annoying and arbitrary since you can dodge a projectile, but you can't really dodge a sword swing in the same way, and at the end of the day, I couldn't really find out a way to make this feel satisfying. Another one. Had a whole ton of ideas for the longbow line specifically. What if they had an attack bonus versus elites to represent how good the Welsh were at fighting far better trained armies? What if they got bonus attacks shooting over trees because of how often they ambushed enemies out of wooded areas? What if they got armor piercing close to their targets because the Welsh actually often use the longbow in close quarters rather than these long-range bombardments to give it massive penetration power? And lastly, what if shots briefly reduced target speed? This is something we could give to spears as well if we wanted, because as I mentioned, the Welsh were famed for their spears, and this is specifically in reference to things like that pinning myth of the guy getting shot to his horse. It just felt kind of cool to me as like a unique niche where the Welsh could slow down their enemy by peppering them full of arrows. Funky idea. Let me know if you like any of these over the ones I have currently. Another table idea. What if fletching was free? What if fletching and bodkin? Maybe just bodkin, maybe only bracer, I don't know. But it felt way, way too good to give all of them for free. I think 1, maximum 2. And at the end of the day, it's a much more generic bonus than I typically like to put into one of my civilization builds. Another one. The Welsh were famous for appropriating enemy fortifications that were built in their lands and subsequently abandoned. What if you could garrison enemy castles when there's like no other units around them to like slowly steal them over time? That would be kind of fun and sexy, but it felt like a lot to stick into the build when it was already so focused on raiding and skirmishing. Like, fortification appropriation was another potentiation receiving an inundation from my gestation station. That's so stupid. And along those lines, maybe enemy fortifications could just be weaker, like castles dealt less damage or shot slower, or maybe all fortifications could build slower or be more expensive. I don't know, something to make enemy fortifications worse, because God knows the Welsh siege needs the help. Lastly, I had 2 other unique options. One would be a Penteolu. This would be a heavy cavalry unique unit, which would give the current Teolu effect in an aura around itself to other cavalrymen. So I would use this option if both the Uchelwer unique unit and the Teolu technology were both disliked. This kind of bundles it all into one little package. Just more generic than I wanted, and I really liked the idea of the Uchelwer. And lastly, the Cyfraith Hywel. This was the unified legal code brought in by my beloved namesake, Hywel the Good. And my idea with this would be that it would be a faux Imperial Age. Get this, what if the Welsh could not research the Imperial Age technology, and instead they could only get to the Imperial Age through a Castle Age unique technology called Cyfraith Hywel? This would be cheaper than normal Imperial Age and research faster, but the downside is you have to build a frickin' castle. Or maybe it could take longer but be cheaper and maybe give another benefit. There's a couple ways you could do it. And my idea here was that it would kind of represent, again, how Wales always had to like play catch up to the rest of Europe, but also how they really only started to modernize once they started to build castles of their own and adopt the feudalistic mannerisms of their neighbors. Just a quirky little Easter egg that would help the civilization play really different, but frankly, it already does play really different. And with all that, we come to the end of this Welsh build. Thank you so much for watching. Before we end off, as always, let's take a look at the likeliness. In my opinion, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it that the Welsh will appear in-game at some point in future, maybe looking a little something like I have here. And on the likeliness, we have a 4 out of 10, slightly lower than the Scots that I graded last week. I think the Welsh are a possible add, but if they were to be added, I don't think it would be for a couple of years at the very, very earliest. There are many other civilizations people would want to see more, and would therefore likely be relegated to the back of the line. But that's just what I think. Now I want to hear what you guys think. How did you like my build? What would you have done differently? Are there any elements of the history that you think I didn't represent effectively enough, or any pieces that you think are just downright broken? I think that the latter is fairly likely for this build. I took some serious risks here, and I'm very excited to hear what you guys think about it. And most importantly, what do you all want to see me do next on this channel going forward? But until then, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.